Craig Newmark again, customer service rep, and still Craigslist founder. We need trustworthy information to elect good leadership and to increase the confidence that we have in elections that are held fairly. We need people to protect elections, and that happened last year a lot by people who put themselves in harm's way. That includes a lot of election officials, and that includes a lot of people who protected elections infrastructure. Going forward, that means combating the spread of disinformation about elections and combating disinformation about public policies more generally. It also includes supporting journalism that fights against the amplification of disinformation. That means combating what they call both sidesism, where news outlets sometimes fake objectivity by bringing on spokesmen who they know will lie to the public. All this is about what I learned in U.S. high school history. A trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy. The immune system failed us in 2016. We did much better last year. Now we need to do even better than that, and we're going to talk about this now. Please join us for panels on technology and democracy and the role of the press. Thanks.
Welcome. I'm Emily Tisch Sussman, host of the podcast Your Political Playlist, and excited today to have a conversation about technology, misinformation, and democracy. Here in the United States, technology plays a major role in our democracy. We have a few large private technology companies with an immense amount of power. The COVID-19 pandemic is a perfect example of challenges that misinformation plays in the digital age. After the insurrection of the Capitol on January 6th, we've seen renewed calls for further regulations from media companies and policing misinformation. To help us understand the misinformation, the platforms, and the spread of it, I'm honored to be joined by some panelists, Debora Plunkett, Jeff Cow, and Jevin West. So Debora, I want to start with you. For some of us, me included, when we talk about technology, we don't really realize there's two parts. There's the platform and there's the information on it. So can you walk us through this relationship and help us understand what has led to the rise that many have said it will weaken our democracy?
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be a part of this great panel. So, the rise of technology platforms has really been exponential over the past probably 10 to 15 years. And when we talk about platforms, we're talking about the tools and capabilities to be able to communicate, largely on the internet. But think about things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram that provide us with the enablement to be able to communicate. But then there's also the content, and that's the information that rides on those platforms that serves all kinds of purposes. I mean, it's the way we live, it's the way we work, it's the way we play, it's the way we communicate. And I distinctly remember, I guess, my goodness, it had to be in 2005 now. So that was quite a number of years ago, when our oldest son was going off to college, and he had a Facebook account. And I remember this because as a national security professional at that time, we were forbidden from having them. That was in 2005. But I got one anyway, because I needed to know what my kid was doing in college. And now just think about today, how prolific those platforms are. So that's one side of the story, these tools that enable us to be able to communicate broadly and widely. The flip side, of course, is that information that rides on them and who is accountable for that information. Is it the individual who posts the information? Is it the owner of the platform? Is it a community at large that's largely maybe not so well defined? We are struggling with all of that now, particularly with the rise of disinformation on these platforms. When it first emerged, it was a great way to communicate. And I don't recall a discussion about, is it true? Is it factual? We just used it to keep up with news and keep up with family members, and it worked quite well. Over the past couple of years, that dynamic has changed for two reasons. I think because individuals, entities, organizations realized how powerful those platforms are and began to use them to propagate information, whether true or false, about causes, about platforms that they wanted to represent. And then there are people, of course, who use it for malicious reasons in order to be able to sway public opinion and persuade people to vote in a certain way or believe in a certain way. And so that's created sort of the downside of that. And so when you talk about influencing our democracy, I think it's happening right now, absolutely happening right now. And we struggle as a community, as a nation, as a global economy, to be able to understand and recognize the power of these tools, but also to understand and recognize when you can trust what you read and what you hear. So there you go.
This is going to be probably a complicated follow-up, but I want to ask you a quick follow-up. Can you just explain the last report that just came out that said that the Iranians and the Chinese attempted to influence the US election, but not flip votes?
Explain it well. I mean, it was an intelligence community. It was issued by the intelligence community, the director of national intelligence. And it, provided details, as much detail as it could be provided in an unclassified way, regarding the US government's position and findings with regard to the way those particular nations had attempted to influence. And there are a lot of different ways to influence. You can influence, by masquerading as someone that you are not, and then using that new personality that's been created in order to convince a body of people of one position or another. And that's the most popular way. But you can also create communities of interest that appear to be large groups of people who have an established position, or it appears to have an established position, and use that. Again, it's all about causing people to believe something that is not true, and causing it to have enough credibility to actually sway public opinion and influence voting.
Well, Jeff, this leads directly into your work. ProPublica has tracked and analyzed more than 10,000 suspected fake Twitter accounts involved in state-backed disinformation campaign from the Chinese. Can you walk us through your findings and also what Twitter's response has been?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a pretty good example of what Debora's talking about, that, social media platforms give anyone a voice, right? And initially we thought that it would be sort of individuals who want to push a certain message, but as the social media economy has sort of become more sophisticated, it's become the case that essentially anyone with money and time can start up one of these campaigns, and the Chinese government, we found, did that throughout 2019 and 2020. And speaking of social media economy, I mean, it wasn't just the government. They actually put out sort of these like contract tenders looking for contractors, essentially PR firms, to help them push their message. And I think it's sort of a logical a progression of how the social media economy has developed. These accounts are basically completely fake. They praised the Chinese government's handling of COVID-19 in the early days, and also tried to aid in other geopolitical goals they have. For example, mask diplomacy that the Chinese government had, sending aid to other countries in the early days, in the language of those target countries. For example, Italy, Serbia, and obviously, other geopolitical goals of the Chinese government. These networks also address that. So, for example, the protests in Hong Kong, which is how I actually first sort of stumbled upon these networks. And more lately, sort of, what the US government has called the genocide in Xinjiang with the Uyghur minority population. And one other example of how basically anyone, with a credit card can push a message. We did a follow-on story where we found the CNN host Larry King was actually paid through intermediaries to essentially record a video criticizing a political dissident of the Chinese government. You know, I think you know, obviously, you know, for you know, Mr. King and his team is kind of a failure to vet, right? And a failure to sort of understand where it was coming from. But I mean, with enough money, you can sort of you know, push your message and also hide who's behind it. So I think that's very concerning. I think, you know, I don't think, like, on the balance, it's necessarily a bad thing that people, you can directly reach people now with social media, right? But it's sort of given rise to a lot of sort of different problems. And, you know, it's not, and at the same time, it's not like, you know, Twitter has not responded to these issues. They regularly, you know, find state-backed disinformation campaigns on their platform and post data about them so that researchers like me and others can look for more. But you know, it doesn't really deter someone, particularly, you know, with a big checkbook, to continue their activities. I think the platforms often look at sort of deterring disinformation as an economic problem. You know, they essentially say, hey, can we make the cost of spreading disinformation so much that it's not worth it? And I think it works great for things like scams, right? Things where the consumer is taken advantage of. But when there's a political actor with deep pockets, it doesn't work as well.
Jevin, what are the latest disinformation tactics we've been seeing, and how have those tactics been used around the COVID-19 vaccine?
So the tactics that we're seeing, and I think it applies to more than just the vaccine and COVID, of course, and that report that you mentioned, when we looked at disinformation tactics and misinformation more broadly during the election, one of the things that we started to see was, at least when comparing it to like the 2016 election, was that there were what we call repeat offenders, this emergence of a repeat offenders that were blue checked verified accounts. These were not accounts that were hiding behind some pretend like Jenna Abrams type of name obfuscation. It was like they were out there blue check and they were continually violating platform policies and were continually amplifying content that they didn't even create. And so we see this broadly now happening, at least over the last, I think, several years, and especially with COVID. When it comes to COVID, there's so much misinformation out there that's created by good, honest, good faith collective, you know, sense making, and all it needs is amplification from someone that has more nefarious intentions. So, like, for the example, in the election, you know, some people were concerned about Sharpies, you know, ruining their vote in Arizona, but really what happened was you have these major influencers on Twitter or other social media platforms, and they amplify that content, sliding it into these narratives that they've been pushing for 3 to 6 months. And you see the same kinds of things happening, of course, around the pandemic. With the pandemic, we've been tracking it since January 24th of last year, collecting, you know, billions of tweets, and we track the kind of collective conversations online. And the things that we've seen around COVID is this sort of honest, sort of, not always honest, by the way, there is like real efforts to sort of create confusion and uncertainty within these environments. But I hate to say it, but one of the big spreaders of misinformation, disinformation was our own government a lot of the time. And, you know, that's a hard thing to say. But when you look at how much it was swamping some of the other tactics that were, of course, happening from bad state actors, et cetera, from people just trying to make a buck from that, you know, information vacuum, it really, in that case, it was more so from our government, and again, from those major influencers online. And so these are the things we can't forget, that there are these people that are pushing disinformation campaigns. There are those you know, foreign adversaries that are pushing these kinds of things, but and conspiracy theorists, again, that are trying to make a buck, but they're also homegrown kinds of domestic problems that we need to address as much as we need to address the foreign issues. At least that's what we found tracking pretty closely the disinformation around the election.
Debora, given your experience in the federal government, do you think that the laws and policies are struggling to keep up with the technology?
Oh, no, without a doubt. Absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, you think about, and it's complicated. I don't want to necessarily give a pass. But it's not just a U.S. Issue. It's a global issue, and I think there are a couple of different reasons. Number one, when we think about the thing that we're talking about regulating most is something that's owned by no one, and it's the internet. And when you think about that in the context of technology that we're so dependent upon, not just for work and play, but for national security reasons, things that are really important to us as a nation, it becomes a lot more difficult. So, the United States could certainly take on developing some norms for behaviors within the US, but without cooperation, global cooperation, they would fall flat. That becomes a challenge. The other piece is, does any nation really want regulation in an area where it's being used for purposes of national security? And so it really is a challenge, but it's one that we need to take on. I firmly believe that we need more policies and laws and regulations to help us understand and manage how to operate safely. And that's the part that I think is most important, how to operate safely and securely using the technology that continues to blossom every day.
Jeff, as a journalist, how does the rise of disinformation impact your work? Oh, I think we've lost your audio.
Yes, I was muted. Sorry about that. I guess with this misinformation, it definitely makes a journalist's work harder. Not only do you have to debunk the misinformation, but once you debunk it, it often becomes a distraction, and debunking that information gives the bad information, in essence, a longer shelf life, right? It keeps it in the public attention for a little bit longer. And so, there are operatives out there who operate on that principle of, flooding the information ecosystem with a lot of misinformation, so that we talk about that misinformation as opposed to sort of substantive issues. That's a huge problem. I think there's also another problem in that, when we hear that so much of, what we see in media can be fake, I think some academics have called this like a liar's dividend. It essentially, allows actually factual things, true things, to be dismissed as fake news. And so, obviously, work of journalism, not only economically, it's become very difficult for a lot of media companies to survive in this environment, but there's also a lot of difficulties in terms of, being perceived as legitimate. Even though, I think, media companies and journalist standards have been sort of just as high as they always have been. And I think it sort of illustrates this broader problem, which is, we've always thought of sort of this marketplace of ideas as this place where everyone can just, say their piece, and, the idea that's most true, right, and the most most people agree with will win out in the end. But on the internet, that's not necessarily true, right? You see sort of these recommendation algorithms that just push certain pieces of information that sort of emotionally resonates with people, that confirms prior biases. And so, what ends up happening is, the most sensational and the most, provocative messages get put into your feed, as opposed to the most, factual or truthful or objective ones.
Jevin, do you think the public is adjusting to the rise of misinformation, or are most people not even aware of it?
That's a good question. And the timing is good on that, Emily, because just yesterday we had what's called Misinfo Day. So this is something our center, the University of Washington, the Center for Informed Public, we put on annually. We do it once a year. And we had thousands of high school and middle school kids from across the country tuning in for an entire day to talk about misinformation, of course. And that's the question I want to ask them. Are you aware of it? Is it something you're concerned about? And the sense that I get talking to high schoolers, talking to the public all the time, they know there's a problem, but the tactics that are being employed and how that's adapting those tactics and strategies for strategically misinforming the public are changing. And so, like, for example, I mean, as Jeff mentioned, this liar's dividend applies to lots of aspects of these tactics, like deepfakes and synthetic media. Some people have heard of it, but most still haven't heard of this technology where you can essentially put any words in someone's mouth and audio files, video files, you can make photorealistic faces, et cetera. And that's already been employed in many forms. We've seen it affect elections in other countries. Surprisingly, it didn't have as much an effect on the 2020 US election, but we have seen it be employed by fake journalists. So this has been reported multiple times across the world where people use these synthetic technologies to create personas that just aren't real. And they're actually getting articles published in fairly high profile journalistic venues. And so, maybe the public isn't aware of something like that. The public generally is not aware of, at least from my sense, of how the internet actually works, how money flows, how, A/B experiments are run, how, how clickbait sort of optimizes, like Jess said, the emotional, evoking kinds of headlines. I think they're also just that self-reflection of our own biases, I think, is something that the public could do more of. But overall, I mean, this idea that so much of the information that they're seeing is not true, people do sense that. My fear and the thing that keeps me up at night is that people will start not believing anything, though, and not trusting anything. And that's the objective of most disinformation campaigns going back all the way to the Cold War. I mean, that's almost like line 1 of paragraph 1 in these papers talking about this, that if you can sort of just create distrust in institutions and people themselves and all of us, then goal accomplished. And so that to me is a big concern. And so, making the public more aware of the tactics that are used, and also, in a world where social media platforms are splintering and it's going to be harder for, researchers and journalists and government agencies to be able to track some of these things, because these, over time, they continue to evolve. And once you finally start to learn about the tactics, then there's another tactic you got to learn. So keeping the public up to speed on that is a challenge, but it's certainly something we have to do.
So Jevin, that's a great segue. I want to ask one quick closing question to each of you. I'll stay with you here. What can the public do to protect themselves? Like, are there flags that people should look for to protect themselves against misinformation?
Absolutely. And this is something that we like to really do. We have tons of resources in our center, but so are lots of other people around the country. I think one of the most important things that the public can do is, first of all, create some self-awareness, of your own habits online and the things that make you susceptible, because we're all susceptible, by the way. I sort of, I've written a book about this. I teach classes at a university. I live and breathe this every day, and I'm susceptible. I tell my students and the public, I'm susceptible. So, we can create these habits of mind. And of course, we don't have time to go through all those kinds of things, but some of the basic tools work even in this advanced information economy in which we live, which if something sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, it probably is. Who's telling me this? What do they have to gain from it? And what makes them an expert? These checking sources, there's so many of the old adages and old strategies that still work in this new world. Corroborate, triangulate. But it is more challenging because things move faster. We're inundated with information all the time. So I think one of the best things that public can do is to try to hone their skills, because we're now expected to be our own editors and gatekeepers, and we're consumers and producers of that information. And so there is a responsibility. So I think that's something it's a role we all have to play, and also to really bring back digital civics, or civics, but in the digital form. To sort of remember that there's people on the other side, at least if they're humans, maybe if they're bots or sort of nefarious actors. But I really think we can do this, trying to bring back the public square and actually get out of the online world sometimes and have one-on-one conversations with people more often. And maybe we'll be able to address this issue that we have, this challenge, this misinformation crisis we have.
Great, thank you. Debora, I'll go to you, ask the same question. What can a person do to protect themselves against misinformation? You seemed excited by Jevin's idea about civics.
Well, I'm excited about a whole lot of what I've heard Jevin say, particularly that he had an opportunity to speak to thousands of high school and middle schoolers about disinformation, because I believe that is our hope. That is our best chance of turning the tide, is to get to our young people really early and help them to have a healthy skepticism. You know, it's okay to say trust but verify, and let's teach them how to trust but verify. I mean, there are credible outlets that will validate, particularly during key national events like elections, who will validate information. Make yourself familiar with them. And if you have a question about it, then search them out for yourself. You cannot believe everything you read on social media. And having that healthy skepticism, I think, goes a long way towards, for yourself, getting to ground truth so that you can make the right personal decision. So I just co-sign everything Jevin said. I love all of it. And, you know, I think our hope is in getting to our young people quickly.
Great. Jeff, same closing question to you. What can people do to protect themselves against misinformation besides reading all of your work, of course?
Thanks. Well, you know, I definitely agree, you know, with the other two panelists, Debora and Jevin. Particularly, you know, there have been studies that have been done that say essentially, you know, content with sort of extreme emotional messages tends to travel well on social media, right? So the flip side of that is, you know, if you're getting something that's like making you, getting you worked up and making you angry, I think you got to sort of step back from that a little bit and ask yourself whether, you know, is this, you know, a message with an agenda, or is this objective reporting? And, you know, obviously we don't, you know, nobody has sort of infinite time to check everything they're reading out, right? But I think sort of teaching an updated form of media literacy would be really helpful. Like Debora said, you know, finding sources that are trustworthy, and that media sources that sort of guard their reputation for, you know, factual reporting very jealously, I think is really important. And it's a lot harder to sort of differentiate these days, but that's one thing that you can do without, you know, allowing your life to be consumed by whether a piece of info on social media is real or not.
Thank you so much. A really interesting conversation that certainly has my wheels spinning. I have a lot of research left to do. It's very clear. Thank you so much to our panelists, Debora Plunkett, Jeff Cow, Jevin West. I'm Emily Tisch Sussman. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.